Hey, we're all really busy outside of class. I know I am. I know you are. Here's a little bit of a review. It'll help you keep up with the work and help you recap what we've been doing so far.
When we compose meaning, we have to keep a couple things in mind. We've said all meaning is contextual, all meaning is historical. But going back even further than that, we've said that most ideas, all ideas, since we're human, start out visual. That is, we have a thought in our head, and it's mostly the way we conceive of things is how they look, how they appear. It's more of a visual process. And from that visual process, then we do the internal dialogue. We think about it and put it into words. It's almost a dialogue within our own head about what it looks like or what our thoughts, how they come together. They come together in language. It's oral. Starts out visual, becomes oral. Then your job as the writer to put it into text. It becomes textual from that point on. That's the important thing to remember, those three parts of the process, because when we read for meaning, that process is reversed. That is, the visual, the oral, and the textual, well, if you're aiming it at someone, which is what we're doing when we're writing text, and even if we're doing it for ourselves to read later and to understand later, it's the same process. The goal is to get that visual, to transfer that visual to someone else the same way that we had it, the same way that we thought about it. Again, context and history, you have to be able to control what someone is visualizing in their head. That depends on their context. Now, going back, as a writer, start visual, think about it, it's oral, create your text. The process is reversed. The process is reversed for the reader. That is, the reader has nothing to go by except the text. The reader decodes your text, hears the voice of the writer, and then tries to create the visual. That's the job of the reader. So you need to, as a writer, use your text to create, or at least help create, the visual for the reader. And we need to use active text that helps the reader create your visual, not whatever they may be thinking in their own context. You want to control it. So we avoid passive text that requires the reader to create the image himself. That is, when he sees your text, whatever's in his head, which may be different from yours. For example, passive is just to say the bride was happy. Was is a big cue here, because now you're requiring the reader to decide. An active way to do it is to say the bride's smile lit up the room like a sunrise. It plays it out. Passive, he was mad. There's was again, and the reader has to determine was. What is mad? Active, he seethed like a volcano ready to blow. You play it out for him. You're taking the context, something that maybe you can think of a volcano in common. Passive, he was greedy. What is the was again? Active, lived, breathed, and thought only of cash. What you've done in these examples is you've answered the reader's first questions that come up. Well, what do you mean when you said the bride was happy? What does the was mean? And what is happy? Is it happy in the context that I'm thinking, or is it happy in the context of one of your memories? Well, if you give that visual, what's anger? Show an angry person. That way the visual is what the first thing that you provide to the reader, rather than him simply decoding the text and saying, I have to imagine what that anger is. I have to imagine what greed is. Because the process is the process that we're going through of transferring meaning. It depends upon the coded word that you provide to the reader. Say, rain, in a rainstorm. That reader is going to, in his mind, going through the process from the text to the oral. He hears your voice say rain. He's going to the visual. Imagine rain. Unless you give him a visual, he's using the last one he had. Remember the example that we used from Skoll's semiotic, saying, unless we're all out in the same rainstorm, when you say rainstorm, everybody forms their own image, which may or may not be fine, may not be what you're talking about. As a writer, you're attempting to control the context by providing as much of it as you can, so that the reader creates your visual. That's the job of the writer, because right now, particularly when you're trying to be rhetorical or persuade, controlling the meaning is important. It's not so important in the idea of a rainstorm, but in advertising, in a job pitch, in an interview, in any type of resume, any type of proposal that you make, it's very important that you control that. It's very important that the reader gets your meaning. That is, you'll be the one as a writer saying, do you get it? Well, it depends on what you've given. Then the control over that is what you have with context. Give some visual. That's our process. History and context, you're doing your best to control both, or at least provide as much as you can. So remember, writing is about history and context, and controlling meaning through the control of history and context. We can't control that. Actually, all we can do is try to maximize and to hone in for the reader on the history and context that you're talking about in your writing. So again, the active voice is what creates a visual. If you use the passive voice, and it's usually followed by was, that's not to say you can't use was, but you better follow it up with an image. In other words, if you say was, then the reader's going to go into their own head and say, what is anger? Let me just put my anger in there. But if you play it out, what you're doing for the reader is providing the history and context that you intend in your writing. And also, the work is being done more by the writer than the reader. In other words, you're giving them those images. You're giving them the visual that's going to inspire the meaning that you want. So that's the key to the personal essay. It's also going to be the key to many of the essays that we do because, again, you want to control that history and context. As we've said earlier, you want them to be able to live your text. And when they live your text in your way, they get your meaning. We'll see you in class.